first of all, just want to say I'm recovering a bit from a cold, so if I space out now and then, that's why, more than usual anyway. So just a few housekeeping things. First of all, the first assignment is due tonight, and I just wanted to, open the floor. If anyone has any questions, it's fine if you haven't started yet. Don't feel embarrassed to ask a question that seems pretty maybe basic if you're far into the assignment, but does anyone have any questions about the first assignment? No judgment zone. Yeah?
How in depth do you want us to go into, like, when we're supposed to relate the study we found in the documentary? How in depth do you want to go, like, into, like, the classroom stuff?
Yeah, so it doesn't have to be super in depth. It can be pretty high level stuff. I think on the OWL, even, let's see, because it's a pretty, there's not a lot of words, right? So you can't get super into detail about things. But see, here's even an example here, which is pretty high level. So let's say the documentary briefly discusses migration of monarch butterflies, find a paper about an orientation system in migratory monarch butterflies. That's not super in depth, right? That's pretty general. Yeah. Answer your question?
I think so. Yeah, I'm just worried I'm not going science-y enough.
I mean, you'll go sciencey because you have to use an empirical article, right? So that's the science. Okay. All right. Yeah.
One more thing, how we'll connect to the course, or what we're claiming, what we're trying to resource. We put it in quotes, like a sentence or something.
Sorry, can you repeat your question?
From the if we find the empirical source,
yeah.
We're trying to find a piece of evidence from the documentary.
Yeah.
Can we just put that in quotes,
That's one way you could do it.
Okay.
You could certainly do it that way. Yep. That's fine. Any other questions? You do not need to cite the documentary. No, that's okay. You could, if you want practice. You're not going to get marks taken away, but it's not a requirement. No. Okay. If you need an extension, please just let me know. Generally, I like to ask people to set a new date for themselves to keep themselves on track, because if something's hanging over you, it makes it a lot bigger than it actually is, right? This is just a short written assignment. Okay, so any more questions? You guys good with that? Okay. Other thing, I canceled class last week. Sorry if you got here and then realized. But on the OWL, there's videos there that you can watch for timing and number, okay? So that's all up on the OWL. All right. Other thing, test grades. So thanks for being patient about that. Test grades will be released this week, hopefully tomorrow, or the next day, Wednesday. And at the end of class today, I'll just go a little bit over the short answer, how you should probably have answered those, because I think that's where people struggled the most on the exam, okay? That'll be helpful too for test 2. It's going to have a very similar format, right? So there's going to be opportunities to review your test, of course, in my office hours. Come see me during office hours. And then the TA, Maddie, will also have some sessions open. Okay? All right. Okay, to start off on something a little cuter. So this is a video someone sent. Thank you for still sending me videos. I really appreciate it. I think there's lots of stuff out there. This is kind of neat. So this is showing a baby bird, a fledgling, wanting to eat this worm, clearly, but hasn't yet reached far enough in its development to know how to eat it. So it just has its mouth open because that's how it gets food most of the time, right, from its parent. So that's actually a pretty neat little behavior. So thanks for sending me that. Okay. Perhaps not entirely related to decision making, but we will be talking quite a bit about foraging today in decision making. So foraging is a pretty big topic when it comes to decision making in animals. In the textbook, there's going to be some additional material that we won't cover in the class. Just cover in the OWL. It tells you how far to read. Don't read the rest of the chapter. That won't be tested. Okay, so really what we're focusing on in decision making is going to be on the foraging piece. And a little bit of other stuff too, but mostly foraging. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so I kind of spoiled it a little bit, what decisions the animals make. Of course, a big one has to do with foraging, but that's not the only decision an animal has to make, right? Perhaps one of the most obvious, what to eat. But there are other ones too, right? Where to live, choosing where your habitat should be, where your home base should be, what route to take. So we talked about this a bit in navigation and orientation. Who to interact with. What members of your conspecifics should you be interacting with? Who is going to be your mate, right? These are all decisions animals have to make. We make them too, right? So what is a decision? What is a decision? Might seem kind of obvious, but it's good to spell it out, right? So it's the cognitive process of selecting one course of action over a variety of options. Right? And the choice is then the outcome of a decision-making process. It could be a verbal response or a motor response, and that is the choice. So a lot of times in animal cognition, in comparative cognition, we talk about how decision-making is actually an inherited trait, kind of shaped by natural selection. Right? Certain kinds of decision-making are more adaptive than others. Right? And this actually brings up this whole concept of free will. I think the textbook has a little box about free will. If you're interested in the philosophy of this kind of thing, it'd be kind of interesting. Some would argue that animals don't have free will, but neither do humans. Right? All of our decisions are potentially shaped by natural selection. So an interesting kind of thought. Won't get too much into it, but there are a lot of scholars that kind of take the stance that free will doesn't exist. Has a lot to do with what's adaptive. Has a lot to do with what is ingrained. But you can take that as you will. Okay. So what to eat? Like I said, a lot of this is going to be focusing on foraging. And there's actually quite a bit of work done in the field of behavioral ecology, basically mathematically modeling how animals will choose what to forage, what they'll eat. Again, this brings in that concept of free will. If you can mathematically model how an organism is going to eat something, do they have free will, right? If you can mathematically predict it. So there's a few different kinds of mathematical models when it comes to foraging. One is known as optimal foraging theory. And it's based on the fact that foraging decisions are made to maximize fitness. And another key point to optimal foraging theory is that energy acquired from food consumption is offset by the energy expended to obtain it. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, we all need energy. Animals need energy. They have to forage for food. They have to find food. But it's not always it's not just a game, right? There's also energy expended to obtain that food. You have to move to find the food. Move your body, right? Searching can also be a cognitive task. So there's energy expended to find food. There's also energy expended to consume food, right? Even chewing requires energy. So when we're talking about optimal foraging theory, we're thinking about how the energy acquired from food is offset by the energy expended to obtain it. Okay, that's important. So it's a pretty, makes sense, conceptual idea, okay, pretty clear, but optimal foraging theory is kind of a formalization of this idea. Okay. All right, so we're thinking about energy, we're thinking about fitness. Right? Fitness in terms of natural selection, in terms of adaptive value, in terms of producing offspring, right? Fitness has to do with the amount of offspring you produce, right? Not fitness like, fitness. The amount of offspring. Right, so optimal foraging theory basically assumes that net energy gain, so net gain, right, during foraging is associated with increased fitness. All right, so let's take some scenarios. We've got these little handsome zebra finches, okay? And they are foraging for food. Some delicious seeds. All right, but it costs energy to find those seeds, to crack them open, to remember where they are, right? Where the food patches are. That all takes energy. So in one scenario, let's say the food is quite abundant, it's not hard to find, there's a lot of it, or it's perhaps a higher quality food source, right? Some food sources are higher quality than other food sources. But in one scenario, there's less energy being expended. And in the other scenario, there's a lot of energy expended to get this food. Well, the thought is that this is related to fitness, right? So in the condition where the animal doesn't have to work as hard to get their food, they can produce more offspring, lay more eggs. And in the condition where it's harder to get the food, they have to expend more energy, they produce fewer offspring. So this is a pretty core idea to optimal foraging theory, right? Energy and fitness. Okay. Straightforward, right? Questions? All right. Okay. So let's think a bit about different kinds of foraging for a second. So central place foraging is where animals collect resources and then carry them back home. Central place foragers. So, like a chipmunk, they have those flaps in their cheeks, right? Where they store a bunch of seeds. They won't eat all of them right away, they'll store them. That's why you see the chipmunks with the big cheeks, if you didn't know, right? But we're also kind of central place foragers, right? We go out to the grocery store, of course it's not quite as difficult as foraging. Don't really do that anymore very much, right? We go to the store, go to the corner store, go to the grocery store, and we bring our food back home. When we only need a few items, we'll probably go on a smaller trip, right, to the corner store. But then when we need a lot of food, we'll travel farther for that food, right? We'll travel farther to a bigger grocery store. When we travel farther, we'll buy more things to make that trip worth it, right? But if you can travel a short distance, you might just get a few items. Don't really have to make the trip worth it. Okay, this is a pretty important idea, actually, making a trip worth it, depending on how far you have to travel. When you have to travel farther for a food patch, you'll probably spend more time in that patch. So, of course, human beings do this when we go to a further grocery store, but animals do it too. When they have to travel farther to get to a source of food, they spend longer foraging in that patch. Okay. And that's showing this idea here. So in this experiment, they set up different cups. Some experimenters set up different cups filled with worms. And they had like a substrate, like sand in them. And starlings love to pick worms out of sand. Okay. So there's a bunch of worms in the cups. Some are close by, some are farther away. And you can see that the further the animals have to travel, they actually carry more worms back home. They have to make the trip worth it. So this is something that optimal foraging theory would predict. And it's something that we see in the wild and in the lab. This is just one example. All right. It also has to do with the heaviness. Okay? And again, you can think about it with groceries. The heaviness of your groceries. So starlings modify their foraging behavior to account for the heaviness of the food that they're taking back home. It might at first seem kind of counterintuitive. Wouldn't you want heavier things shorter? But again, think about your own behavior. If you're taking a longer trip, you'll probably buy more groceries, right? So the number of worms carried on each trip increases with the longer travel times. Again, you can think about it like making the trip worth it to you. You spend more energy to get that far, you gotta get that energy back. And there you go. Similar to reserving long drives for a larger shopping trip. Of course, again, it's a lot easier for us than it is for most animals. The cost comes in the form of dollars, really, which is a whole other thing. But I think it's a nice way to conceptualize it, to understand it, comparing to the supermarket. All right. So pretty cool. You can predict how an animal will forage with math, and they end up actually behaving that way. That's kind of neat. So it doesn't just have to do with travel time. It also has to do with how long it takes to extract and consume a food item from the source. Okay, so what do I mean by that? It's known as handling, okay? But let's take these crabs, for example. They like to eat mussels, right? But of course, mussels come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, right? Small, medium, large. And to get to the meat of the mussel, right, you have to crack open the shell. So a small mussel might be easier to crack than a larger one, but there's less meat inside, right? There's less energy. So optimal foraging theory in this kind of scenario would actually predict a kind of Goldilocks zone in the middle. And when we look at natural behavior, that's what these little crabs tend to do. They tend to pick mussels that aren't too large or too hard to get into, but also ones that aren't too small, don't have a lot of energy in them. Okay, so it's not just travel time, it's not just the amount of time it takes, it's not just the heaviness of the food, it's also the handling. How difficult is it to get into that food, right? You can also think about how high value the food is. Some foods have higher caloric value, right, than other foods. And those foods in the animal kingdom are going to be considered better, right? Higher calories is good in nature.